But it's very interesting to me that you picked that as part of the title. Why do you believe that? Why this emphasis on a new religion? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, we're at a point where the kinds of beliefs that I'm talking about Black people, are no longer held as an opinion. It's at the point where a certain kind of person lives these beliefs in a way that is so impervious to any kind of reasonable discussion that you start to notice that it really is a matter of religion in the sense, particularly of Abrahamic religions, rather than opinion. And there are all sorts of things.
So what's the difference between religious belief and mere opinion in your estimation?
It is that many religions require that at a certain point you suspend disbelief and stop relying on conventional ratiocination and logic. There's a point at which you're supposed to have faith and believe in miracles of some sort. And it's at the point where when it comes to race, there are things that one is supposed to insist on and believe, regardless of whether they correspond to reality or even any sense of justice. One in Christianity is supposed to be dedicated to showing that you have faith in Jesus. Within the religion that I'm talking about, the cardinal point is that you show that you know that racism exists, just that you know that it exists. Now, what you're going to do about it is irrelevant. Whether or not what you're showing actually is racism is irrelevant. The fact is that you knew you were supposed to be looking for it. And only that imperative, as ding-dong as it sounds, explains a lot of the things that we've seen, especially lately. There was a real jump in the rails after summer 2020, but even before that. And it means that a lot of people look at what goes on with the race scene in the United States. And I know to an extent, there is that in Canada too. Whenever you see these sorts of things happening and you see brilliant people making arguments that don't make any sense and utterly despising those who disagree with them as if they were heretics, word chosen deliberately, it's because what we're seeing, even though these are people who are usually very secular in their self-conception, it's a religion. This is exactly the kind of person who sent Galileo into exile a very, very long time ago. And the people back then often didn't think of themselves as religious. It was just considered truth. We're faced with that same kind of thought, even if the word isn't applied. And the reason I'm putting it that way is not just to annoy people by calling them religious, although I think it will annoy them. And it'll also annoy actual religious experts who will say that I'm stepping outside of my lane, which I most definitely am. But all of this stuff only makes sense if you realize that these people are religious and that they have to be treated as parishioners and not as people who are up for an argument. The question is, how much of an obstacle is racism after formal segregation has been battled, after racial attitudes changed profoundly in the 1970s? And I'm just old enough to have watched that happen. It gets to the point where, okay, racism does exist, both social and institutional, but how much of an obstacle is it to doing pragmatic things that will make poor Black people less poor and all Black people happier? So quick example would be that these days you can look at the fact that Black kids tend not to do as well on standardized tests as other kids. It's there. Now, you can look at that and you can say, well, if Black kids don't do as well on the test, that's because of racism. And so we need to eliminate the test because the test is racist. Now, in what way is the test racist? 40 years ago, maybe those tests asked you what wine goes with chicken. That hasn't been true for generations now. So it's not about asking people things that they have no reason to know. How is it racist? And there are people today who even will imply that Black thought is somehow incompatible with tests like that, which is very close to saying that Black people are incapable of disembodied abstract thought. And many whites will chime in.
It's probably identical with that claim.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, especially given that the people who are saying it know very well the history of that being said about Black people. And so you look at the tests and you say that because Black kids don't do well on them, they are examples of systemic racism. Well, you have to get rid of racism, so you have to get rid of the tests, which means that you tell America that Black kids can't have their abstract reasoning measured without it being racist. And then when you get somebody saying, well, then Black kids just must not be as quick on the uptake, you call them a racist. And in the meantime, it's ignored that you consider helping Black kids get better at the tests, helping Black kids' parents realize what free test prep programs there are in those neighborhoods. The tests just take a little bit of practice, but you're not supposed to talk about it because the tests, quote unquote, are racist. It's an abuse of language. And it's abuse of the very conception of what racism is. That's not what my mother raised me in. That's not your grandmother's racism. That's something that comes from a way of thinking that was marginal in 1955, became sexy in about 1966, and here in 2021 is being treated as impregnable wisdom. Someone Black has to speak out against that. So that's what I mean by the exaggeration and the artificiality and the outright harm that comes from these sorts of things.
Well, and with regard to it being a pose, so is it a pose of? So I could say, well, is it a pose of unearned virtue? I mean, virtue is not easy to earn. True virtue. You have to establish. Let's say we'll see where we go with this. Maybe you have to establish a relationship with beauty, and beauty is real. You have to establish a relationship with truth, and truth is real. And so to earn virtue is difficult because beauty and truth are imposing and formidable. If you have any sense at all, you see that. And so that's a daunting task to establish genuine virtue, and a terrifying task. And is the pose the willingness to adopt? See, because when I talk to the ideologue types, and maybe that happened most famously with an interview I had with, I think it was Helen.
Just thinking about it. You mean Michael Eric Dyson, right? Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't thinking about Dyson. I was thinking about a GQ interviewer, and that interview's been watched like 40 million times now. It's this ideological pose is the aping of virtue, as far as I can tell, and I mean that. And it's in sort of a technical sense, is that you master this language and it contains the expressions of true virtue. But, you know, the kind of problems that you were talking about, and I see this on the environmentalist side of things too. Well, how do you get Black kids to do better in elementary school, let's say? Well, that's a more manageable problem. It's a problem that would take a little bit more humility to conceptualize. And it's also a really, really hard problem. And so to be virtuous in your attempts to solve that would probably require the dedication of your entire life, really, to take a good crack at that problem, right? Because that's a tough problem, man. And so maybe you don't want to do that and then you're enticed by your educators into this alternative possibility where all you really have to do is master a set of propositions and you're on the winning side. And that also gives you some convenient enemies, and maybe it fulfills to some degree the religious instinct. And it appalls me to see the universities complicit in this, and that they've come to see that. And I think part of that falseness and artificiality that you described, I think the fact that exists is part of the overbearing insistence that the veil not be lifted and that no one question this, because what is underneath it is so damn ugly.
Yeah. Jordan, you have nailed something. I would be loath to go so near that word virtue, because the last thing I want to do is imply that somebody isn't virtuous. Nevertheless, you're getting it in that it's an unearned virtue which people are settling for, not because they're so callow as to wish to be virtuous without earning their stripes, but because religion is attractive. And so if you are surrounded by people who are brandishing this message that everything that you don't like is racist and you can get beyond it that way, it's not that you're lazy. It's not that you're trying to get stripes that you didn't earn, but it's comfortable, because part of being in that religion is that there's an us versus them conception, which is very comforting. You're part of a mission of uplift, which is very comforting. And in a university, that religion is there. It's as if they're, people from a church who are behind tables out in the plaza who are waiting to recruit people. That's there as soon as you hit campus. And so that's why so many people, and now it's not just Black kids, it's also white kids, fall for this way of looking at things, where what it is you become virtuous without having done the sorts of things that ideally one might have. You're virtue signaling, and it is unearned virtue, but it's because you wish to have a cloak. You're seeking a comfort zone. I can't hate anybody for that, but it does mean an awful lot of mendacity. That's